This amazing X-Men title is not just incredibly fun to play, but one of the most important and influential releases in the history of the fighting game genre. Sure, this might look like a simple 2D game on the surface that celebrates the X-Men franchise, but the things it introduced mechanically and the features that it would include would pioneer the way forward for many, many fighters to come. In fact, in terms of Capcom produced fighting games, I would go as far as to say that this was their most innovative release since the introduction of the revolutionary Street Fighter 2. So with all of this said, join me today as we look at the precursor to the legendary Marvel vs. Capcom series and look back at the classic X-Men video game that started it all. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of X-Men, Children of the Atom, and why it deserves respect. Yeah. Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, Marvel had allowed a number of different developers and publishers to produce games that took advantage of their famous licenses. The majority of these were pretty terrible, relying on the Marvel brand to carry the product rather than the gameplay itself. Most of these were home computer games functioning as budget titles, developed in Europe, and on home consoles they were usually rush jobs published by Acclaim, often under their infamous LJN branding. While usually disappointing on the home front, the realm of arcade games was different. Servicing from Japan, arcade offerings would be produced, such as Sega's Spider-Man, Data East's Captain America and the Avengers, and who could ever forget Konami's X-Men. All of these were fantastic beat-em-ups that had been designed to eat players' coins around the world. Konami's X-Men beat-em-up and Capcom's X-Men fighting game may both be excellent titles that feature these mighty mutants, but the reality is that Children of the Atom has a closer beat-em-up relative. Among the brilliant games of this genre, we of course had The Punisher, an impressive title that was produced in this arcade brawler golden age, which was a lot of fun to play. This technical, to excuse the pun, marvel was very well produced and allowed players to fight against more than 10 enemies on screen at once without any signs of slowdown. This would mark the first ever Capcom developed video game that would feature Marvel characters. However, as you all know, this would be far from the last. Marvel was extremely pleased with the Punisher game and was keen to continue their working relationship with Capcom. But it wasn't just the Punisher that had impressed the American comic book giant, but an even more lucrative video game Capcom had made. I'm of course talking about Street Fighter 2. Little is needed to be said about this one, as it is easily one of the most successful and innovative arcade games to have ever graced this earth. Considering that it is often credited for rejuvenating an entire industry and carving out the modern fighting game niche in its image forever, it's no wonder that Street Fighter 2 perked Marvel's interest. Marvel could see the lucrativeness of this game, so they wanted a slice of Street Fighter 2 pie for themselves. Scott Smith, a product manager who worked for Capcom USA at the time, in an interview with Polygon adds that it's weird considering where Marvel is today, but Marvel wanted to get into the market in Japan, and I think they were looking for opportunities, and video games were one of them, to penetrate the market and kind of make their properties a little more well known. Katsuya Akitomo, who would work as an advisor and artist working on Children of the Atom, adds, Konami had just released X-Men, which was a big hit for them. I think it was entertaining enough, and people talked about it, but the thing is, a lot of players in Japan thought the game was unfair. For a lot of Japanese gamers, fairness is one of the most important elements of the gameplay experience, so because of that, it didn't do well in the Japanese market at all. Also, even though the 1991 X-Men comic had come out by then, Konami's X-Men arcade game was based on an animated pilot. I think only one episode ended up being made, so by the time Konami's arcade game came out, it just seemed kind of old and the visuals were obviously different from what the comic book had shown us. So I thought it wasn't really that interesting and it was a little too old, so I felt that we could do better. Alex Jimenez, who would provide design support for the game, adds Marvel was not doing well financially, you know. They were on the rocks, really on the rocks, and they were more than willing to license us the characters quickly and easily. So they gave us X-Men, and we took it and ran with it from there. Once the deal was struck to create this game, Capcom still needed to appoint someone with a lot of experience to direct the game, so would turn their attention to Akira Nishitani of Street Fighter 2 success. He was given a choice of whether to work on X-Men or Street Fighter 3, with him rather boldly opting to work on Children of the Atom. The game's planner, Takeshi Tezuka, comments on Nishitani opting to work with them, adding, When you deal with a franchise like Street Fighter, it's a fighting game, but the characters are basically human and thus limited to realistic, albeit greatly exaggerated movements. But with the Marvel series, you're dealing with superheroes who can do anything, and there had been lots of requests to do something different, so I thought it was a good idea. X-Men Children of the Atom first hit the arcades in December of 1994, and was a game that took advantage of the power of a CP System 2 arcade board. 1994 was an interesting year for Capcom and their fighting game endeavours. Not only did we see the release of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the most refined version of Street Fighter 2 yet, but we also received a feature-length Street Fighter movie. To cash in on the style of play, Capcom would also make some brand new fighting games, such as Darkstalkers, Muscle Bomber 2, and of course X-Men Children of the Atom. A lot was going on. In their own ways, each of these titles were impressive, but perhaps the X-Men game was the most intriguing of the lot, due to the fact that the characters already had a fan base and an established universe. But what else would be put in that would help make this one so special? Akira Yasuda, also of Street Fighter 2 fame, would work as an artist on Children of the Atom, and he comments, while some of the characters in the Street Fighter series could be said to have superhuman powers, for the Marvel games we did, like Children of the Atom, all of the characters were defined by being mutants with superpowers. So from the get-go, we decided to try and make their special moves more intense and flashy. Prominent fighting game community member James Chen, when speaking to Polygon, adds that the combo system was so freeform and it was so revolutionary at the time that nobody knew how to do any of the stuff. You could launch people, go into air combos and all that stuff, and nobody was doing it. Capcom would do a top-notch job with this game, delivering an experience that was faithful in capturing the spirit of its namesake comics, by using colourful animation and even the use of voice actors from the X-Men animated series. The game featured a basic story that is supposedly loosely based on the franchise's Fatal Attraction storyline. So within the game's plot, members of the X-Men set up a fighting tournament to determine who is strong enough to defeat the mutant supervillain Magneto. You know, the lunatic who wishes to eliminate the human population from his space station Avalon in order to free the oppressed mutants. The game starts out with a roster of 10 characters on the player select screen, with heroes and villains both being playable. On the hero side, we have Cyclops, the mutant known for his ability to emit powerful beams of energy from his eyes. We then have Storm, who can fly and attack with wind, ice and lightning based moves, and Wolverine, who has retractable claws, animal keen senses, enhanced physical capabilities, and a powerful regenerative ability known as a healing factor. We then have Iceman, who has the ability to manipulate ice and cold by freezing water vapour around him, Colossus, who can transform himself into a metallic form, making him as hard as nails, and finally, the lovely Psylocke, who has the ability to use psychic energy combined with fighting techniques. Speaking of Psylocke, she did not become one of the X-Men until 1986, as prior to that she was more heavily associated with another Marvel comic book series known as Captain Britain. Sadly, Captain Britain has not appeared in any fighting games, which I personally think is rather criminal. Captain Britain as a superhero is said to uphold the laws of Britain, so I guess maybe he's too busy collecting TV licensing fees or something. In terms of villains to players in the game, we have Omega Red, an evil serial killer born in Soviet Russia, who was experimented on by the USSR. In the game, he uses his carbonadium tentacles to increase his attack range. We then have a Sentinel who is playable too. Sentinels are mutant hunting robots, and are in fact heavily featured within the X-Men animated series of the 90s, and in this game function as the largest playable character. There is also Silver Samurai, who was a villain originally from a 1974 Daredevil comic, who is a Japanese mutant who uses his power to charge his katana. He wears samurai-style armour made of a silvery metal. He is notable for being the only character in this game who cannot kick, but instead uses a variety of slashes with his sword. When we take into account the Marvel Capcom deal was partially made to assist the American comic brand growing in the Japanese market, it makes you wonder if this was the reason as to why he was chosen to be in this game. The last initially selectable fighter is Spiral, who has 6 arms she can use to attack with at the same time, in addition to her levitating swords and shape-changing abilities. Further to this, we have the boss characters, the first of which is the Juggernaut Bitch. This large, powerful opponent is in fact a regular human who was empowered by a gem belonging to a deity. Becoming a literal human juggernaut, he possesses superhuman strength and durability, and even wears a helmet to protect him from psychic abilities. Although not a mutant, the Juggernaut has been featured as a prominent member of the Brotherhood of Mutants. In a simple playthrough, the game's final boss fight takes place against Magneto, a powerful mutant and one of the fictional subspecies of humanity born with superhuman abilities, who has the ability to regenerate and control magnetic fields. Magneto regards mutants as evolutionary superior to humans, and rejects the possibility of peaceful human-mutant coexistence. He initially aimed to conquer the world to enable mutants, whom he refers to as Homo Superior, to replace humans as the dominant species. Marvel aficionados will be able to tell you that the character is a bit more layered than that though, as it is revealed that Magneto hates humans due to being a Holocaust survivor. Obviously, we still have one more fighter to mention, bringing the total roster count up to 13. The game includes one final secret boss, Akuma, from the iconic Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, who, as you all know, debuted in that game as a secret boss as well. Akuma's inclusion was pretty exciting, and would later help lead to the X-Men vs Street Fighter title. One thing about this though, which I must mention, because I've always found it quite amusing, is Akuma's sprite. Rather than making a new one, the team just copy and pasted the one from Street Fighter 2 over to this game, making him look rather out of place. This slapdash trend would continue into future games though. For example, with characters like Morrigan still having a 1994 Darkstalker sprite in games like Capcom vs SNK 2, an incredible 8 years later. In terms of the gameplay that can be found in this X-Men one, the game shares many tropes in common with other Capcom fighters of the period. For example, contests are settled in 2 out of 3 rounds to decide a winner. The game also features a mechanic extremely similar to the gauges found in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Darkstalkers, published earlier that same year, that fill up as players perform both regular and special moves. In this game's case, this function is known as the X power gauge. These meters start at level 1 but reach level 2 when they are half filled. When this is achieved, auras surround fighters, but more techniques can be utilised when the gauge is filled to its maximum level. These meters can be depleted in a number of ways. First, players can perform an X ability which consumes a small portion of X power gauge, or a Hyper X which consumes a greater portion of gauge. Meter consumption is also used when breaking one's fall from a throw or performing a counter throw. The biggest innovation this title features that was not included in its sister Capcom fighting games that year was the fact that the combo system featured long combos that could even be performed mid-air. This would mean characters could fight it out in pioneering multi-tiered environments, in which in some cases the ground crumbles and the characters fall into lower parts of a stage. This fast-paced aerial combat would be a key ingredient that would be used as part of the identity of the entire Marvel vs Capcom series, and would be one of the main mechanics that made the game stand apart from others. Via Polygon, Katsuya Akimoto added in the past that Children of the Atom was obviously about controlling the madness, and if you have a theme of controlling madness, the result will be something that looks wild, right? Nishitani and Yasuda, I think, were big proponents of this idea of controlling the madness, and I think that became a very prevalent theme in the game. I felt that the more flashy the game was, the more fun it would be, and I think that's what every team member felt as well. I mean, maybe we did too much with the game, maybe went too far, but we didn't really know that or feel that at the time. In this game, there was also more subtle elements included, such as various tactical maneuvers. For example, characters had the ability to roll, something characters could not yet do in Street Fighter until the release of Street Fighter Alpha the following year. The game had plenty of features to set it apart. This included giving the players the ability to perform super jumps and roll maneuvers. These could be used to roll away or towards an opponent after falling. Projectile moves could now also be used differently than in other Capcom games. Now players could aim them. The game would also present 2 systems where gamers could choose between a manual or automatic blocking system. The arcade game impressed many, and like all successes in that realm from the time period, it would of course only be a matter of time until the game would arrive on home formats, a beat with a vast amount of challenge to actually make this possible. This game was just so freaking impressive, so getting this one home was quite problematic. The plan was originally to put the game on the 3 most powerful game consoles on the market, the Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation and the 3DO. An issue that Capcom faced though was that the game used 32 megabytes worth of character data alone, and the consoles on the market at the time offered a maximum of 2 megabytes of RAM in total. With it quickly becoming clear that the 3DO was a doomed system, it would not be long before that version of the game was cancelled altogether, thus meaning Capcom would only have the PlayStation and Saturn to worry about. During the development of the two versions of the game, Capcom would end up giving up on the PlayStation conversion too, as the system's limitations were making work very difficult. This just left the company with the Sega Saturn one to work with, and since the game was released in the pre-expansion cartridge days, even the Saturn port would need to have a third of its arcade animation frames removed from the character's movements. In regards to the Saturn version of the game, the Japanese and Western versions of the title differ, in that if you own a Japanese copy of the title, a cheat code allows players to play as the Juggernaut in the two-player versus mode. This feature was removed from international releases, with Capcom stating it was only in the Japanese version due to it being left in by mistake. Despite fewer animation frames as an early Saturn release, the Sega Saturn game was very well received. GamePro would state the game was converted perfectly to the Saturn and applauded the accessible controls, fast gameplay, colourful graphics and lack of slowdown. Sega Saturn magazine also would go on to declare the conversion as arcade perfect, aside from a few barely noticeable missed animation frames, commenting that for the first time comic book superheroes have been successfully translated to game format. Next Generation, on the other hand, was less impressed with the game, complaining that 2D fighting games had been done to death, writing fighting games off as a mere fad that they predicted would soon go away. Despite their scorn for the apparently dated fighting game genre, they did admit that Children of the Atom on the Saturn had smooth animation, brightly coloured graphics, and a good balance of characters, strengths and weaknesses. Maximum would also give the game a strong review, praising the conversion and complimenting the inclusion of a new survival mode. As mentioned earlier, Capcom gave up early on trying to convert the game to run on the Sony PlayStation, but in a not so shocking twist, the game's greedy publisher, Acclaim, desperately wanted to make more money off of the title, whether producing a PlayStation version would be a good game or not. Taking advantage of the PlayStation's massive user base, Acclaim would contract the converting out to Probe Entertainment, who would also be tasked with developing a PC version of Children of the Atom. Due to the porting to the basic hardware being so difficult, Children of the Atom would not arrive on the PlayStation until 1998, 4 years after the game's arcade release. The at that point dated game would of course be critically panned. Next Generation stated that, overall, if you crave 2D fighting fare, you could do worse than this game, but you can also do much better. What X-Men Children of the Atom mostly proves is that companies should learn to stop projects before they spiral past the time when they're relevant. IGN would not even dignify the game with a proper review, summarising, "We're not going to waste too much time on this game. The character animation bites, the loading time is horrible, what more do you need?" Children of the Atom would have been a 16-bit phenomenon in older times, but in our day and age, however, Children of the Atom bombs. Game Informer would also add, if this game had been released a couple of years ago, we could forgive it for its shortcomings, but by today's standards, Children of the Atom needs to be more refined. Play the Saturn version, it's much better. Overall, when it comes to home formats, X-Men Children of the Atom reflects the usual narrative of 2D fighting games being pretty good on the Sega Saturn, but pretty terrible on the PlayStation in comparison. We have heard this story many times before, and with this game, it is no different. Despite the poor conversion and one of the most popular pieces of hardware of all time, this X-Men title's influence is undeniable, and it contributed to shaping the future of fighting games in many ways going forward. Dana Mooreshead, who was head of creative services at Marvel Entertainment during Children of the Atom's release, reflects back on the game, stating, "We couldn't have planned it any better if we tried. It was a huge seller. It's when the X-Men animated series had come on the air, so it was a huge, it exceeded everybody's expectations." Alex Jimenez praises the significance of Children of the Atom, stating, "Capcom banked on the popularity of X-Men. They took a bit of a gamble. I've got to give them credit for that. Children of the Atom was their first hero licensed game with Marvel, and it paid off extremely well. Children of the Atom was a very, very popular game. Very successful title. Not only did this title strengthen the working relationship between Marvel and Capcom, but we of course saw a Street Fighter character appear alongside the X-Men for the first time, which would spark the thought track for the full X-Men vs Street Fighter title, and all the games that would come after it. That's without even mentioning the Capcom tier stage fighting and air combat that makes the superhero fighting game so innovative and so important as a building block to what would come after it. Due to all of this, you really should respect this game. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, why not check out my video on X-Men Mutant Apocalypse by clicking the link here. Yeah, cheerio!